We're going to move on to our final PowerPoint in pharmacology, and this one is more about the kind of the practical stuff, the regulatory stuff, and we'll kind of get through that, and then at the end hopefully you'll have a better idea of what goes on kind of in the pharmacy day to day and what your responsibilities are. So there's a lot of drug laws, which makes sense because drugs can be abused. Many different types of drugs can be abused. And so there's lots of drug laws and regulations. Federal ones, they assure that available drugs are safe, effective, and prepared in accordance with manufacturing standards. This is a very important oversight function by the federal government, and we'll get into a bit more of who's responsible for that. And then provincially, the province controls the distribution of drugs within the province. They regulate individuals authorized to prescribe drugs, and then they oversee the record keeping of whatever drugs need to be recorded. So Health Canada is in Canada our big drug regulator. In the States, of course, you're aware of the FDA. Here we have Health Canada. They review clinical trial applications for any clinical trials that are going to be conducted here in Canada. They review submissions from manufacturers before basically drugs get released onto the market. They monitor the safety of drugs in the Canadian market and communicate safety risks to healthcare professionals and to the public. And this is done in collaboration with industries, veterinary industry and the human health industry and pharmacy industry, all that stuff. And then they enforce the pharmaceutical industry's compliance with regulations, including those related to the clinical trials, manufacturing of drugs, and the reporting of adverse drug reactions. There are certain adverse drug reactions that are what's called reportable, and if they are seen, they need to be reported. That's true in human medicine. It is also technically true in vet medicine, although it doesn't seem to be so formally upheld. And then we have the CFIA, and it's responsible for the administration and enforcement of the Food and Drugs Act as it relates to food. So they're the ones who are interested in things like drug residues in meat and that sort of thing. Definitions. Prescription animal drugs are approved drugs that may be dispensed only under the direction of a licensed veterinarian because of their potential for toxicity or abuse. And a chemical is designed as a drug if it meets one of these three criteria. So it's either recognized by at least one of the official drug compendia. I don't know if you know what those are, but they're these big books that are like a compendium of all the different drugs that are available in whatever country you're in or whatever. So recognized by at least one of those, used in the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of disease. So that's a pretty broad classification there that will encompass a lot of different drugs, or as a non-food chemical that affects the structure or function of the body. And then prescription drugs by a veterinarian requires a valid VCPR, if you remember what that is, Veterinary-Client-Patient relationship. So all of those have to be involved. Controlled substances is something that you guys will deal with every day, pretty much, no matter where you're working. This is regulated by the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act in Canada. It regulates the manufacturing, distribution, and dispensing of controlled substances. They're listed under 6 schedules. Basically, the important ones here, most opioids are Schedule 1 drugs, so that's your morphine and fentanyl and things like that. Benzodiazepines, remember we talked about them briefly yesterday, about how they're used for anti-anxiety, like diazepam, which is Valium, and barbiturates. Those are Schedule 4 drugs. There are some others that fall, in obviously in different schedules. I'm going to provide you with links so that you can look them up and you can know what's what. Not so much because I'm going to be testing you on that, but just because when you're in practice, you may need to know some of that stuff. You'll definitely need to know which drugs are controlled. One is, well, it's I actually don't know exactly how they categorize them. I think Schedule 1 drugs, I think, are maybe the highest risk of abuse. So if you think about what drugs are most commonly abused, things like morphine, heroin, which is very similar to morphine, the opiates, we've got oxycodone, and all those things are kind of like the high profile abused drugs. Hormones? Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, they're not. They don't fall in that category. It is a drug. Yeah, because they alter the function of the body, right? So, right, so we have narcotic control regulations and text. You must follow these regulations closely when dealing with narcotics. Again, there are going to be links on the next slide. I'm not going to click on them today, but I will pass on these PowerPoints to you and you can look at them on your own just to clarify if you'd like. And a veterinarian must be registered and licensed to prescribe controlled drugs. The vet assumes liability for controlled substances used in practice. So again, whoever the owner is, it's going to be a majority owned by a veterinarian, and that veterinarian will be responsible for all the drugs that are used in the practice. The good news is in Nova Scotia, you guys are now licensed yourselves. So at least some of the blame could technically fall on technicians now, where even though ultimately it is the vet's responsibility. It used to be that everything that happened in the clinic fell on the vet, but now you guys have a certain amount of responsibility yourselves, which personally I appreciate. Exciting links! Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. For those of you who like reading acts and policies, which I have learned to love since starting this job, there's a link there to that. There's also a link there to narcotic control regulations, and that is actually something that might be worth a read, at least in part, because these are regulations you will deal with day to day, for sure. This is just an example of a narcotics log where they want, the bottle number, the drug, how many mils are used, how many mils you got, when it was received, that sort of thing. This is it's called a disposition log. So every time you get a controlled drug in, you'd fill out one of these, and then you've got books, log books with pages and pages of this is how many mils I took from the bottle, and this is who I used it for, and this is how many were wasted, and this is what was spilled, and 2 signatures or whatever. So it's quite a complicated thing. It's very important to do it right. You guys will learn about this in clinical also. Extra and off-label drug use. This happens extremely commonly in this profession because there's a lot of pharmaceuticals that don't go through the process of being approved for animals because, well, it's extremely expensive to go through an approval process. And most drugs we are able to use in their current form off-label from human pharmacies or whatever. So there's a lot of drug use that goes on that's extra label or off label. So extra label drug use is actual use or intended use of a drug in an animal in a matter that is not in accordance with the approved labeling. So that's saying, like, for instance, I believe that Convenia was labeled for urinary tract infections in dogs but not cats. Well, I can use that extra label and use it for urinary tract infections in cats. It is labeled for skin in cats, so that would be like an extra label drug use. Specific conditions. Valid veterinary client-patient relationship, VCPR, like we just talked about on the last slide. That's absolutely essential for anything that's prescription, which is why clients get all upset when you aren't able to give them Revolution over the counter. But that's because by law, we're not allowed to do that. We have to have that relationship. If we've seen that client and that patient within the last year, we can dispense over the counter without an exam. But if we haven't seen them within the last year, we're not legally allowed to do that because it is a prescription medication. So we're not trying to be nasty people. We're just trying to follow the law. So we have to have that VCPR. Appropriate animal identification. We have to know who this is being given to. Documentation, including drug labeling and record keeping. This always has to happen with prescription drugs. And then we always have to use caution in food producing animals because anything we give to an animal could potentially end up in the human food chain. This would be a really big problem if, for instance, we didn't have withdrawal times on antibiotics. And then humans were suddenly eating a whole pile of antibiotics from livestock, we'd have an even worse problem than we already do with antibiotic resistance. So we have to be careful. Off-label drug use. This is using a drug that is not intended for that animal or for that condition. So using a human drug in an animal is off-label. You need the owner's consent. Usually this is just in the form of, well, this is a human medication, but we have found it works well in animals. Is that okay with you? And they're like, yeah, that's fine. I think that we skip this step a lot, but it's important that owners know that this is an off-label use, even if it's something that we use every single day, off-label. Drug residues. We've touched on this a couple of times. So the presence of either a drug or its metabolite in the cells, tissues, organs, or any edible product coming from an animal, including milk, that's the drug residue. This is regulated by Health Canada and the CFIA. So again, drug withdrawal times. The length of time after administration of the drug, the animal and or its products must be kept out of the human food chain. I think you're familiar with that by now. The withdrawal period is different for each drug. Why is that?
They get eliminated differently.
Yep, exactly. Different half-lives, essentially. Like there's a different rate of elimination from the body, or clearance, which is what we use to determine that. And then the common example is milk withdrawal times for dairy cattle. This is the most common example because dairy cattle are pretty much always producing milk, whereas meat cattle are producing meat once, right? So we get a lot of drug withdrawal time. Withdrawal times that we have to deal with a lot of time in dairy cattle. We always used to say when I worked with dairy, when a cow wasn't doing so well, they were going for a career change. Anyway, so you can look at table 2720 in your textbook to look at examples of drug residues and withdrawal times and stuff. Adverse drug event reporting. So when a new drug is approved, there's an animal drug application NADA number generated, and any adverse event associated with a drug that may or may not be drug related is called an adverse drug event. It's considered an ADE or adverse drug event regardless of whether that drug was used on or extra/off label. So however it was used, the drug was used, this event occurred, it's an adverse drug event. Doesn't matter how it was being used. It's still an adverse drug event. The goals of adverse drug event reporting is to capture anything about the drug that wasn't already noted or recognized in their pre-approval testing, because once you get a drug out into the wider population, you're going to see all kinds of other things pop up. And if you don't tell the company that these things are happening, then they don't know that, and they can't inform consumers. They can't inform patients and physicians and the public and vets and everything. So that's why they do that. It is voluntary. It does exist in vet medicine, like I say, as well, although I think it's a lot more rare for us to do it. Unless it's something really, really new and amazing, which I really hope is not the case very often. Drug compounding is the manipulation of a drug other than that described on the approved label. Compounding, well, I'll talk a bit more about how it's done practically, but why might a drug be compounded? We can't accurately dose this drug. So something that comes to mind, if I have a dog with IMHA and I want him on long-term low-dose aspirin, and it's a Shih Tzu because they always seem to have IMHA, then his long-term aspirin dose is going to be 5 milligrams per day. The smallest you can get in human medicine is 81 milligrams, which is a children's aspirin. So I'm going to be having that compounded because it's really hard to break up an 81 milligram tablet into enough pieces to make 5 milligrams. Doesn't work out. So you get it compounded into the right concentration. Maybe it's not palatable to the animal. You have to give this every day, but the animal thinks it's disgusting. Maybe you want to make it taste like beef or tuna or something. Or if it's not available as an approved drug, sometimes we can get access to a drug in a compounded format. That is something that I have done before. So this is limited to custom compounding for a particular patient. We don't generally, sometimes we do order a whole bunch of compounded medication if there's like something like metronidazole, where a cat dose tends to be 50 milligrams, but the smallest tablet is 120, no, it's 250. So we can't really make that into a cat dose easily. So some of them we do order a whole bunch compounded, so I don't know. But it tends to be limited to custom compounding for a single patient. This patient needs X milligrams of this drug, and let's put it in a peanut butter flavored liquid or something. And we can do this.
Is this done, like, do every clinic has this?
Every clinic has access to compounding pharmacies. Yeah. And it's usually done by an external compounding pharmacy like Summit, and I don't know how to say that. Chiron? We use Summit. Or Chiron or whatever. Maybe it's French, Chiron, or I don't know. Anyways, Summit is the one that I always use, and it's amazing. You order a drug, and it's in, I think, Markham, Ontario, or something like that. It's in Ontario somewhere, and you order a drug, and it's here the next day. Very quick, usually.
So it's not done in-house?
No, it's not done in-house, although there are systems whereby you can do it in-house. So there are flavor systems. We used to have one at one of the practices I worked at, but it ended up just easier to order them. It's very messy to try to do it yourself. There are compounding pharmacies in town who will do it, human compounding pharmacies. So if you're looking to get a human medication compounded, they can do that. They don't have all the fancy dog flavors or anything, but they are able to compound things into liquids as need be. And these compounded drugs must be in compliance with regulations for extra label drug use. Dietary supplements and nutraceuticals, these are kind of tricky. They fall into a category that's somewhere between food and drugs. Sometimes there's really only a fine line between a supplement and a drug, but they are regulated differently. A nutraceutical is defined by the North American Nutraceutical Council, or Veterinary Nutraceutical Council, as a non-drug substance that is produced in a purified form and administered orally to provide agents required for normal body structure and function with the intent of improving the health and well-being of animals. It sounds all well and good. These are not considered prescription or over-the-counter medications. They're not considered to be drugs, right? They're dispensed and administered without any medical supervision, so you can imagine that this could cause some trouble in some cases. And essentially, there's absolutely no regulation for these. You may have heard on the news recently about, in human medicine, how there's a lot of kind of naturopathic or homeopathic medications that have been proven essentially to have zero effect, and they're being sold for all kinds of money, and people are getting rich off selling these things that do nothing. And that's more like the natural, all natural, like cold remedies for kids and stuff. They do absolutely nothing. Caution! Although nutraceuticals are readily available to consumers, no efficacy or safety evaluations by the FDA or Health Canada are required prior to the marketing of and sale of these products. So that's kind of what we were just saying. In addition, the raw materials, manufacturing process, and product stability are not evaluated or standardized. Therefore, products may vary and the bioequivalence between products cannot be assured. So just because this says that it's, I don't know, what's one of those Dr. Oz things, raspberry ketone or something, and then this one says it's raspberry ketone, there's nothing to ensure that they both have the same thing in them. Or really that is even anything to do with raspberry ketones. So this to me is a rather huge oversight when it comes to, taking care of the general population, the gullible general population. Anyway, that's nutraceuticals. Drug procurement. It's kind of like, where do we get drugs from? We get them from drug manufacturers, so that we do get them directly from manufacturers. We get them through distributors. That's more common. So we make orders all the time through distributors, and that's how we get most of our drugs. One of those compendia that I talked about earlier is a compendium of veterinary products, CVP. and that provides a comprehensive list of veterinary pharmaceutical companies and available product lines. So this is going to focus exclusively on the veterinary approved products. So most clinics, I believe all clinics have to have a copy of the CVP, and I think they also have to have a copy of the human version of that, which is something or other pharmacopoeia. Anyways, you've got to have those. If you want to know if it exists, if you don't want to know anything about it, it's going to be in those compendia.
But it'll only be labeled products, right? Anything
Labeled.
off-label, extra-labeled won't be in that.
Right. So anything this is only stuff that's labeled for veterinary use. Yeah, that's going to be in the CVP. You can get human medications from local pharmacies, and that's done fairly commonly, and you'll have a lot of clients asking for prescriptions to be called in or asking for prescriptions to be written for them to take to the human pharmacies. I know there's a lot of pushback in our industry on that because the truth of the matter is that the margin, like profit margin in this industry is tiny to begin with, and drugs is one of the places where some clinics try to recoup some of that cost. So it's hard for us to send clients out the door to pharmacies. So a lot of clinics have started charging, $15 for a prescription or whatever, which, to be honest, I think is kind of fair because we're not just writing a prescription, we're also telling them about the drug and what to be careful of. We're talking about side effects. We're talking about things that are specific to animals. So I think that asking them to pay $15 to have proper counseling on it, which the pharmacist cannot provide, I think is not that bad, actually, when you think of it that way.
Would be legal anyway.
Human hospital pharmacies can be used. They can be a good resource for veterinarians and staff. I think in this area we don't use them that way. There are pharmacists now who do get specialized veterinary training. They can choose to do that. So they get a certain amount of training in veterinary medications. I think that's still quite rare, but I'm hoping that's going to turn around because it would really be great to have partners out there in the pharmaceutical kind of field that could help us out in terms of client education and stuff. Local feed stores, this is most of the time, this one bugs me a lot. I think I've mentioned that before, that local feed stores can sell antibiotics to farmers and stuff without prescription. I don't like that. I think it's wrong. Hormones too, I suspect they can do. I don't actually know exactly what they can sell, but I know they do antibiotics. Mail order supplies. This is your like 1-800 PetMeds type places. They do require a written prescription from the veterinarian. So people who decide to go buy their drugs on 1-800 PetMeds, we will receive like a fax at the clinic that we have to fill this all out and write a prescription and fax it back. Most people don't bother going through this. So I only had a couple of clients who used to do it pretty regularly. It was mostly just annoying. But anyway, mail order suppliers exist. Internet pharmacies, same thing, basically, in this day and age. Is it a lot cheaper? It's somewhat cheaper. It's not that much cheaper when it comes to the stuff that's expensive anyway. But anyway, people will take whatever deals they can get. Drug storage and disposal. The storage recommendations will always be outlined by the manufacturer, and they'll be available in the information that comes with any drug. They have to be followed to make sure that this drug remains safe and potent. So we need to make sure this drug's going to have its intended effect and that it's safe. So store it as per the recommendations from the manufacturer, and you're going to be good. So usually they'll say store between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius and keep in a dry area, or shield it from the sun or whatever. So follow those. Expiration dates, again, these are based on controlled stability studies, so we know how quickly these drugs kind of start to break down and how long they're guaranteed to be effective for. So that's what expiration dates. This drug is guaranteed to be effective until the end of May 2016 or whatever. After that, you can try your luck if you want to, but we're not allowed to sell drugs that are expired. We can give them away to people, and a lot of clinics do that, give away expired drugs to people who are in need of drugs for their pets but can't afford them. So we can give expired drugs away, but do not sell them. That's not legal. Drug disposal. Expired drugs and unused drugs should not be dumped down the drain or flushed down the toilet, placed in the trash, or discarded in the ground. They should be, technically, returned to the manufacturer or the distribution company for credit. Like I said, that happens quite routinely. Or should be sent to a reverse distribution company that kind of like they pick up the expired stuff and the unused stuff and whatever. All right, prescriptions. You guys will get really, really good at reading prescriptions. Hopefully your vet has better handwriting than most. Prescriptions are only valid for animals if they're written or authorized by a licensed veterinarian, which means someone else could write them up. I often have techs write up prescriptions for me and I just have to sign them. First I read them, then I sign them. There are essential elements that are required by law. There are standardized abbreviations, which I'll highlight some of the most important ones shortly. And again, requirements for medication labels as well. This little graphic here just shows some of the kind of required stuff. You can have a look at that if you want to.
You also get
A prescription, technically that word means a written order. There are certain requirements that have to be on a written prescription. So the veterinarian's name and signature, license number of the veterinarian, the patient name and species, the drug form, so tablets, capsules, liquid, whatever, the dose, 25 milligrams, regime, twice a day or whatever, and the length of treatment for 14 days. Precautionary statements, anything like, this must be given with food, or keep it in the refrigerator, or, that sort of thing can be on there, or may cause vomiting, diarrhea, or whatever. If there's something important that has to be said about that medication, that goes on there. Refills, most of the time in our profession, refills are 0, because most of the time, if a refill of something is required, usually there's a recheck required first. That being said, there are certain animals on medications where I'll give 6 months or 1 year supply, so they'll have refills on their file, or at the pharmacy in certain cases. If there's a drug, they'd get there. And of course the date. When was this written? Most pharmacies won't fill a prescription that was written, 3 years ago. The essential elements. So basically a printed or stamped name, address, and telephone number of the licensed veterinarian. The drug name, concentration, and quantity, the directions for use, the full name and address of the client. This is on the prescription, not the label. Some people in my last class tried to put all this information on a label. Identification of the animal, so their name and species. Any cautionary statements, right? Withdrawal times being a big one too. Number of refills, expiration date, and DIN. So the DIN is a drug identification number. That will be on every prescription medication. So that's always got to be on your prescription, or at least on the label. Okay, and your VCPR. So the vet has to have examined the animal and have knowledge of the animal's care. And in Nova Scotia, this lasts for 1 year from the last exam. So if this animal has been seen by the same vet or the same practice within a year, then there's an active VCPR and prescriptions can be given at the vet's discretion. So this requires all 3 parties involved be consistent. So client gets a new dog. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden they have a relationship. They don't have an active VCPR with the vet that they had with their last dog, right? That makes sense. Here are your common prescription abbreviations. You can go through these at your leisure. The big ones, SID, BID, TID, you guys already know those. Left and right eye and both eyes, ODOS, OU. Ears, I would say it's used less commonly, but similar to eyes, except we use A instead of O. PO by mouth, sub-Q, and then, PRN we know is as needed, and D is days, H is hours. So you can go through these, make sure you understand them all, and you'll be fine. You'll get used to these very, very quickly. And these are consistent throughout human medicine as well. I am going to not scare you, but I am going to just mention drug calculations here. We're not going to get into them at this point and stress you out. But just to give you an idea of how I go about doing it, and then you guys can kind of think it through and see if that's something that you might get on board with. But ultimately, like I say, I think tomorrow might be the day that we get into calculations, right? So the most common calculations, you're converting between units of measure. You've already seen that. Pounds to kilograms being by far and away the most common of these. So convert 16.4 pounds to kilograms. How would you do that? Divide by 2.2, because you got to make it smaller, going from pounds to kilograms. Calculating the correct drug dose. Of course, this is very, very important. How many mils of a 5 mg per mil solution do we need for a total dose of 17.4 milligrams? So that would be an example. Maybe. It's like, yeah, essentially. Basically 3.5, yeah. So you can do that in your head. It's not that bad. Using percent solutions, how many mg per mil is a 10% solution? Da, da, da. Or constant rate infusions. So this drug has a concentration of 10 mg per mil and must be delivered at 6 micrograms per kilogram per hour. What should the drip rate be for a 31 kilogram dog? This is the most complex calculations you'll get into. CRIs are complex to calculate, but if you work through them slowly, they're quite simple. When you break them down, we'll go over this. Don't worry about it right now. The good news is that anything that needs a CRI, there's drug calculators out there for. There's really great ones available through the Anesthesia Support Group, VASG. They have really good CRI drug calculators. There's other ones available too. Basically, you put in the weight of the animal and the drug you want, and they kind of just give you everything else. Sometimes you put in the actual dose that you're looking for as well. So this is my idea of making calculations easy, because this is what's easy for me. So if you have a calculator, the math is really simple. Basically, like I said before, in order to make sure you're doing the correct calculations, you can simply cancel out the units. So if something's on, this is considered on the top, because this is the same as 6.2 over 1. So if there's something on the top, and you're multiplying it by the same thing on the bottom, those units will cancel. So here's the same thing. And then so if we go from kilograms to milliliters. So you can look at that, you can think it through, see if it makes sense. I'm not going to explain it further than that because I've learned that I shoot myself in the foot when I do that, and I make you guys confused and then you cry. And I don't want that. So just have a look at that, see if it makes sense to you. If it does, great. Either way, we're going to talk more about calculations and how to actually do them tomorrow. Just remember, if you are doing it this way, arrange the different known values in the equation in such a way that the units cancel each other out. So it showed you that. So in this case, 10 mg per mil had to get flipped upside down. 10 mg per mil is the same as 1 mil per 10 milligrams. So you can flip them back and forth. So you just arrange them so that they cancel. And that way you get the right answer. So this can be done stepwise. So you get 0.3 mg per kg times 6.2 kilograms, and then you get your milligram dose. And then you get your milliliter dose by calculating milligrams by the concentration, multiplying those together. So it can be done stepwise, and I believe that's how Bianca does it. So you might see that ultimately we're doing the same thing. She just does it one step at a time. Whereas when I write it out, sometimes I just write it out like that. However, when I'm in clinic and I'm in a hurry and I want to make sure I'm doing things right, I often just go one step at a time. Let me figure out how many milligrams I want. Okay, I know how many milligrams I want. Now let's figure out how many mils that is. Okay, now I know how many mils that is. So you can take it one step at a time, and that sometimes is a lot easier for people too. So I just mentioned this, multiplying by 1 over x is the same as dividing by x. Or I didn't mention that, but just important for you to know. If you need to divide by something and you're trying to fit it in into like a formula that looks kind of like that, you can multiply by 1 over something. It's the same as dividing by that thing. And always remember, 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. This is your biggest conversion. This is the most important conversion you'll do 1,000,000 times a day. because owners want everything in pounds. So a lot of times we weigh animals in pounds. At the Emerge, what they've done now is they've actually got charts because they weigh everything in kilograms. So they have charts. If the owner wants to know in pounds, they can just look at the chart and they can stop asking. So that's we do everything in kilograms because we dose everything in kilograms, mg per kg, right? There is a link down there. I'll allow you to access that yourselves. It is a video on doing medical calculations. So if that's helpful to you guys, you can go ahead and have a look at that. Otherwise, we can kind of see how things go over the next couple of days with calculating, and hopefully I won't confuse you very much. Hopefully it won't be me doing it. Because if it's me, I will confuse you. I will just be like, but that's how it goes. That's how I teach calculations. That's just how it is. Anyways, hopefully you guys will get someone better than that to teach you. All right. Questions? Loving the pharmacology.
That's a nice symbol.
Thank you.
Did you make it?
No, I didn't make it. I stole it from the internet. And this link here at the bottom of this page is another video. It's a long video about doing drug calculations by a nursing student or something. I don't know if he's a nursing student or a nurse, but he goes through kind of medical calculations also. No questions? Everyone's happy? We're all done pharmacology, so congratulations.